Ichigo mastered his Quincy powers, he would have some of the most potential that I've ever seen in an anime character. The upper limits of his powers with access to the Quincy amps, transformations, and perhaps even a shrift of his own pushes Ichigo into unparalleled heights. So today, let's explore what that might look like by asking, what if Ichigo mastered his Quincy powers? To start, let's establish how the Quincy function and where they derive their power. This is integral to understanding how ridiculously powerful a mastered Quincy Ichigo truly is. The Quincy are effectively a race of spiritual beings that exist in the Bleach universe that manipulate reishi to perform their amazing abilities. Every living Quincy is in some way tied to Yhwach, and in some rare cases, like Sternritter, receive unique and insanely powerful abilities directly from him. These are called shrifts. Effectively, the Quincy are an analog to the Shinigami or Arrancar that have taken the manipulation of spiritual energy to the next level. Where Quincy's separate themselves is through their unique ability to absorb and break down reishi in the atmosphere, combine it with their own spiritual energy to perform their techniques. This is in a lot of ways similar to Naruto's Sage Mode, where the user will take on a naturally occurring energy and utilize it with their own to create powerful effects. Those are the basics. But similarly to the Shinigami or Arrancar, the Quincy have abilities that are unique to their race that each member can do. Things like Flash Step and Sonito come to mind, with the Quincy equivalent being Hirin-Kyaku, which is an interesting naming convention compared to the other Quincy techniques, clearly taking more influence from the Japanese language rather than German. This is likely due to who initially named the technique in the anime, being the Ishida family, namely Uryu, who at the time was clearly separated from the Wandenrei. Bleach is a Quincy ability that gives the user either an offensive or defensive amp, that even with the low levels of efficiency like Ichigo's, has been shown to stop the blade of even the most powerful opponents like the Quincy King himself. And that was an instinctual activation that Ichigo had effectively no control over. So to say that this amp is ridiculous is a major understatement. Putting this technique in the hands of a master is insane, and later in this video we'll discuss that Bleach is much more powerful than you may even think. The Volstandig is the Quincy transformation, much like a Bankai or Segunda Etapa, and literally translates to perfect form. The effects of this transformation have some shared effects between the users, like multiplying the user's power by a huge margin, allowing the Sternritter to turn the tides of battle against the Gotei 13 and society as a whole. Generally speaking, this transformation amplifies the pre-existing effects of the user's shrift and often allows them new techniques that fall under the same umbrella of powers that their shrift gives. And that's effectively it. Each faction has a tight list of skills, a few transformations and amps, and they more or less uniformly follow this formula. Now to Ichigo. First and foremost, we're going to have to give him a shrift, and to do so, we need to assign him a letter. Of course, Ichigo could never canonically just get a shrift, since it needs to come from Yhwach, but if we don't, the mental hurdles we need to jump through to explain how he plot armors himself into manifesting this power is beyond my capabilities, and respectfully, can only be managed by Kubo himself. As for which letter, well, there are a lot of amazing ideas on the internet, as this has been debated for years, some of which that I really thought could work are P, the protagonist, which is hilarious and incredibly fitting, but sort of breaks the immersion. This just explains his plot armor in a really meta way. H, the hybrid, tries to highlight Ichigo as a unique creature in the span of the universe, outside of the normal boundaries. Again, this really just goes on to explain his plot armor and his manipulation of hollow Shinigami and Quincy powers simultaneously. G, the Getsuga, really seems the most fitting, as Getsuga Tensho translates to Heaven Piercer, which in some way implies the slaying of a god, or at least the idea of one. Given that Ichigo struck down the incapacitated Soul King, this really seems fitting, as Yhwach goes to explain that only someone with Ichigo's unique physiology could manage this feat, making it an ability signature to him. The Fate is the coolest one in my opinion, as it acts as a foil to Yhwach's Almighty, which allows him to selectively choose favorable timelines that fit his master plan. The Fade would allow Ichigo to cut through those strings that Yhwach has on the timeline and carve his own destiny. Conceptually, shrifts just enhance the pre-existing powers and personality of a person and amplifies them. For Ichigo, his abilities have always been centered around amping his physical parameters and protecting those around him, so I think his shrift could work in a few different ways with that in mind. Immediately, I'm drawn to the concept in Battle Shonen where no matter how many times you beat down the protagonist, they get back up and fight stronger. This has been quantified by Dragon Ball Z with Zenkai Boost and now Vegeta's Ultra Ego. This effect when utilizing his full Standig's amp could also consider how badly beaten his friends have been and what kind of danger they are in. The greater the peril, the greater Ichigo's power rises. This effectively is already what occurs in Bleach, but having some explanation for it in a quantifiable and maybe numerical way could be really cool to visualize what protagonist determination would actually look like in practice. The second possible shrift ability harkens to the letter F, the Fate, where Ichigo gains the ability to cut through fate and upset the natural and expected flow of the universe. How this works in function is a little bit complicated, but if we think about how Aizen always has the upper hand and constantly revealed that the expectations of his opponents were wrong, and when they had thought they had attacked him, they would actually be on the receiving end of the attack themselves. Well, imagine if Ichigo could reverse this effect, and when an opponent anticipates an attack from Ichigo and is certain that their countermeasure would absolutely work, Ichigo's Shrift allows him to upset that expectation and counter their counter. Again, harkening back to Sage Mode Naruto, Frog Kata allowed him to attack with natural energy and overcome the perception of Pain and the 12 connected Rinnegan eyes. Pain was certain that he dodged the attack, but Naruto landed a devastatingly powerful blow nonetheless. This moment where Ichigo would upset Destiny is where I think his Shrift ability could fit in perfectly. With a letter and the Shrift down, we need to discuss multipliers and the techniques Quincy Ichigo would receive. To begin, let's look at his signature technique, Getsuga Tensho. Ichigo condenses Reiatsu and hones it at the tip of his sword, thus magnifying the slashing power of the technique and launches it forward. Generally speaking, how this technique has progressed over the course of the show is by becoming larger and more powerful. Think Rasengan and Udama Rasengan, or Kamehameha and Super Kamehameha. Functionally, no differences, but they are assumed to be more powerful because they are larger and appear later in the show. Let's change that formula a bit. If we take the principle of techniques like Rasengan Uzuhiko, and maybe more famously the Spirit Bomb, Ichigo can absorb Reishi in the atmosphere and massively hypercharge his Getsuga Tensho, again much like Naruto's Sage Mode multiplier, and skyrocket his power to theoretically infinite levels, depending on how much Reishi there is in an area. I think giving this Quincy Getsuga Tensho a side effect of exhausting the Reishi in the area, thus making it difficult for Quincy's who utilize atmospheric Reishi to empower and manipulate their techniques, thus making it an effective counter to the otherwise reliant Quincy faction. We could additionally add Ichigo's Hollow influence to this, since Hollow Reiatsu is poisonous to Quincy's, which would only multiply the power of the technique, but also make it the perfect finishing move to take down any Quincy he would come across. With his abilities out of the way, let's talk about how powerful statistically this version of Ichigo would be. For the baseline of the multiplier stacking we're about to do, Bankai alone has been recognized as somewhere between a 5 and 10 times multiplier for Ichigo's stats, but in reality is likely far above that. The power scaling community determined that Ichigo jumped from somewhere around mountain level of AP to country level when using his Bankai. This represents an increase in power not of 10 times, but rather 1,000 times, and most notably, Ichigo's speed is the stat that has increased the most in this transformation. Adding both Blut and Full Standig's multipliers are more difficult since the concept of numerical values aren't that well documented in Bleach, but we do have this translation which states that while strengthening the body with Reishi, as Blut does, the strength increase is comparable to a Shinigami at the time of Bankai. I have a love-hate relationship with this statement because Quincy's are absolutely stacked and should have been spamming this technique a lot more than they did. Full Standig is a little bit more difficult, as it is the successor to Let Steel, which took Uryu to somewhat comparable to non-serious Mayuri, to absolutely one-shotting Mayuri's Bankai. However, the difference in these abilities is said to be like comparing heaven to earth and sees many characters leap bounds above their competition. Again, the general consensus is that the multiplier for Full Standig is comparable to that of Bankai, somewhere around a 5 times multiplier, but again, that doesn't necessarily translate to what is shown. So if we were to calculate the numerical value of how powerful Ichigo would be while stacking each of these amps, we'd see a low end of something like this, where our base of 1 is multiplied by Bankai, Blut, and Full Standig, giving us a rough 125 times multiplier, which is greater in strength than Super Saiyan 1 in multiplicative potency, and I shouldn't need to tell you how powerful that transformation is. But if we take the values that they have been shown to increase, utilizing the power scaling approach, we'd more than likely see an equation like this, where our base of 1 is now multiplied by 1 billion times. To understand this fully, let's assume we gave this multiplier to a normal human, an Ebizu level threat who has building level AP and supersonic speed. This person's speed would jump 17 tiers and land them into massively faster than light, and around 12 tiers of AP, putting them squarely into mountain busting territory. Putting this kind of power into Ichigo, who already is a multi-solar system buster with faster than light plus speed, would push him off the tiering scale and into a territory where Dragon Ball Super characters exist. The spiritual pressure he could give off would crush Aizen, Yuha, and pretty much solo the entire verse with literally no effort whatsoever, and all we've done at this point is give him multipliers that in theory he already has access to. Unironically, Ichigo at this point, with just multipliers, negative diffs 99% of anime. JJK, Naruto, One Piece, and pretty much any show without some ridiculous level of hacks gets obliterated. Narratively speaking, Quincy Ichigo makes no sense, unless Ichigo takes the beat fire with fire approach like he did against Ukiura in the Vasto Lord transformation. In that case, sure, it works, but it really makes no sense when it is a known fact that hollow powers are poisonous to Quincy's and Ichigo already has access to them. However, if we're looking objectively at what powers Ichigo has access to that would numerically amplify his powers by the largest margin, it has to be the Quincy powers. Excluding a Shrift or full stand dig, and just looking at loot, this would be the equivalent of unlocking a secondary Bankai for Ichigo that requires much less finesse and training. This kind of amp stacking already would prove to be too much for most fighters in the verse, and that's not even considering that we've excluded manga spoilers entirely. Bleach is a battle shonen, so it's not a stretch to consider that Ichigo will be receiving new powers as the anime continues to air. I won't go into what those are, but the powers that this max potential Ichigo would have is beyond comprehension, and genuinely, he becomes a multiversal threat, potentially capable of taking on even the likes of Goku. Well, maybe. That's all we got. If you enjoyed at any point, supporting the channel would be greatly appreciated. My end of the year goal is to reach 400 million subscribers and buy Mr. Beast a private jet of his own. Gotta help the community as much as possible. Thanks for watching. Thank you for sticking around to the end. You're the absolute GOAT. Peace.